18. It was time for the Zillenovs to catch the train back to London. Archibald Moon said goodbye at the very first corner, and with a tender smile for Vadim, who behind his back usually referred to him by an indecent noun supplemented by on rollers, glided away, holding himself very erect. For a while Vadim rode slowly right next to the sidewalk, with one hand on the shoulder of Darwin, who walked alongside. Then he said a quick but fussy goodbye and sped off, making a sound with his lips like a broken klaxon. They reached the station, and Darwin bought platform tickets for himself and Martin. Sonia was tired, irritated, and kept slitting her eyes. "Well, thank you for the hospitality, for the nice party," said Miss Selenov. "Give my regards to your mother when you write to her." But Martin did not transmit the regards. Such things are seldom transmitted. As a rule, he had trouble writing letters, how to tell, for example, about that rather muddled, somehow unsuccessful and unpleasant day. He had scribbled 10 lines or so, recounted the anecdote about the student, the closet, the cousin, assured his mother that he was in perfect health, ate regularly, and wore an undershirt, which was not true. Suddenly, in his mind, he saw the mailman walking across the snow. The snow crunched slightly, and blue footprints remained on it. He described it thus: "My letter will be brought by the mailman. It is raining here." He thought it over and crossed out the mailman, leaving only the rain. He wrote out the address in large and careful hand, remembering for the 10th time as he did so what a fellow student had once said to him: "Judging by your last name, I thought you were American." He regretted the way he always remembered about working this into his letter only after it had been sealed, and he was too lazy to reopen it. He inadvertently made a blot in a corner of the envelope. He squinted at it for a long time, and finally made it to a black cat seen from the back. Miss Edelweiss preserved this envelope along with his letters. She would gather them into a batch at the end of each semester and tie them crosswise with a ribbon. Several years later she had occasion to reread them. The first semester letters were relatively abundant. Here was Martin's arrival in Cambridge. Here were the first mention of Darwin, of Vadim, of Archibald Moon. Here was a letter dated November 9th, his name day. "This is the day," wrote Martin, "when the goose sets foot on ice and the fox changes his lair." And here was a letter with a crossed-out but distinctly legible line: "My letter will be brought by the mailman." Miss Edelweiss recalled with piercing clarity how she used to walk with Henry along the scintillating road between fir trees weighted down by lumps of snow, and suddenly there was the rich tinkling of multiple bells, the postal sleigh, and the letter, which she hastened to take off her gloves in order to open the envelope. She recalled how during that period, and for almost a year after, she was terribly afraid that without telling her anything, Martin might join the Northern White Army. She found some consolation in the knowledge that there at Cambridge a veritable angel exerted a pacifying influence on her son, excellent, sensible Archibald Moon. Yet Martin might still slip away. Her mind was completely at ease only when Martin was with her in Switzerland on vacation. Years later, when she reread those letters with such anguish, they seemed, despite their tangibility, of a more ghostly nature with the intervals between them. Her memory packed the intervals with Martin's living presence. Christmas, Easter, summer. Thus, for a period of 3 years, until Martin finished college, her life was like a series of windows. She remembered them well, those windows. They were the first winter holiday, and the skis Henry bought him on her advice, and Martin putting them on. "I must be brave," said Miss Edelweiss softly to herself. "After all, miracles do happen. One must only have faith and wait. If Henry appears once more with that black armband, I shall simply leave him." And she smiled through the tears that streamed down her face as, with trembling hands, she continued unwrapping the letters. The first Christmas homecoming, which remained so vividly impressed in his mother's memory, was also a festive occasion for Martin. He had a queer sensation of having returned to Russia. So white was everything, but being ashamed of his own sensitivity, he did not share it with his mother, thus depriving her in the future of yet another poignant recollection. His uncle's gift pleased him. For an instant there materialized a snow-covered slope in a St. Petersburg suburb, although, of course, in those distant days, the toes of Russian felt boots used to be inserted in the plain loops of light children's skis, which, moreover, had a string for the skier to hold on, attached to their upturned tips. Not so the new ones, real substantial skis of flexible ash, and the boots, too, were real ski boots. Bending one knee, Martin adjusted the heel cable and bent back the stiff lever of the side throw. Its ice-cold metal stung his fingers. When he had put on the other ski as well, he picked up his mittens from the snow, straightened up, stamped his feet once or twice to see if everything was secure, and swung forward. Yes, he found himself back in Russia. Here were the splendid rugs of snow spreading the Pushkin poem which Archibald Moon recited so sonorously, reveling in the scuds of its iambic tetrameter. Above the burdened firs, the blue sky shone clear and bright. The cluster of snow dislodged by a jay, flying from perch to perch, would dissipate in mid-air. Martin passed through the woods into the clearing from which the previous summer he used to descend the local majestic. He could see it far below with a straight column of rose-colored smoke coming out of a chimney. What was it about that hotel that lured him so strongly? Why must he again hasten there, when in the summer all he had found there had been a bevy of raucous, angular English flappers? But there was no doubt that it beckoned to him. The reflected sunlight in its windows flashed a silent sign of invitation. Martin was even frightened by such enigmatic intrusion, such abstruse insistence. He had seen that signal before, displayed in some detail of the landscape. There he must go down. It would be wrong to ignore such blandishments. The firm surface began whistling delightfully under his skis as Martin sped down the slope faster and faster. And how many times afterwards, sleeping in his chilly Cambridge room, he dreamed sped like that, and suddenly, in a stunning explosion of snow, fell and awakened. Everything was as usual. He could hear the clock ticking in the adjacent parlor. A mouse was rolling a lump of sugar on the floor. Footfalls passed on the sidewalk and faded away. He would turn over in bed and instantly fall asleep again. In the morning, still drowsy, he heard the other sounds from the parlor. Miss Newman fussing about, moving things, putting coals on the fire, tearing paper, scratching a match. Presently she departed, and the silence was gradually and delectably filled with the morning hum of the ignited hearth. Nothing special there after all, reflected Martin, and reached toward the night table for cigarettes. Mostly middle-aged blokes in sweaters. Good example of how metaphysics can fool you. Oh, it's Saturday today. Off to London. How to come Darwin keeps getting letters from Sonia. I'll have to worm it out of him. Good idea to cut Brzezinski's lecture, but here comes the hag to wake me. Miss Newman brought his tea. She was elderly, red-haired, had foxy little eyes. "Last night, sir, you went out without your gown," she remarked phlegmatically. "I'll have to inform your tutor." She drew open the curtains, gave a brief but exact report on the weather, and was gone. Martin put on his bathrobe, descended the creaky staircase, and knocked on Darwin's door. Darwin, already shaven and washed, was eating scrambled eggs and bacon. Marshall, a flat textbook on political economy, lay open near his plate. "Got another letter today?" sternly inquired Martin. "From my tailor," said Darwin, chewing judiciously. "Sonia's handwriting isn't too good," remarked Martin. "It's rotten," agreed Darwin, gulping some coffee. Martin walked around behind him, placing both hands around Darwin's neck, and started squeezing. "The bacon went down anyway," said Darwin, in a smugly strained voice. 19. That evening they were both off for London. Darwin spent the night in one of those charming two-room flats provided by clubs for bachelors, and Darwin's club was one of the smartest and statest in London, with overstuffed armchairs, glossy magazines, and thick silent rugs. Martin ended up this time in one of the upstairs bedrooms at the Zillenovs, Nellie being in Reval, and her husband marching on St. Petersburg. When Martin arrived, nobody was at home but Mikhail Platonovich Zillanov himself, busy writing in his study. A sturdy, thick-set man with Tartar features, the same dark, lustreless eyes as Sonia. He invariably wore cylindrical, detachable cuffs and a starched shirt. The shirt front bulged, imparting a dove-like quality to his chest. He was one of those Russians who, upon awakening, first of all put on trousers with dangling suspenders, who wash only face, nape, and hands in the morning, but wash them most thoroughly, and who regard their weekly bath as an event not devoid of certain risk. He had done a goodly amount of traveling around at his time with intensely active and liberal politics, conceived life as a succession of congresses in various cities, and had miraculously escaped a Soviet death, and always carried a bulging briefcase. And when someone said meditatively, "What shall I do with these books? It's raining," he would wordlessly, instantly, and extremely skillfully swaddle the books in a sheet of newspaper, rummage at his briefcase, produce some string, and in a flash tie it crossways around the neat package, a process which the luckless acquaintance, shifting from foot to foot, watched with apprehensive attendrissement. "There you are, sir," Zillanov would say, after a hasty goodbye, was off to Riga, Belgrade, or Paris. He always traveled light, with 3 clean handkerchiefs in his briefcase, and would sit in the railway carriage completely blind to picturesque spots which the fast train traversed in its thrusting efforts to please, immersed in a brochure and making occasional notes in the margin. While marveling at his inattention to landscapes, comforts, and cleanliness, Martin nevertheless admired Zillanov for the plodding, dryish courage of his, and every time he saw him could not help recalling this seemingly unathletic and unfashionable man who probably played only billiards and perhaps bowls, had escaped from the Bolshevists by crawling through a drain pipe, and had once fought a duel with the Octoberist Zhukov. "Welcome," Zilanov, extending a swarthy hand. "Sit down." Martin sat down. Zilanov again contemplated the half-filled sheet of paper upon his desk, picked up his pen, imparted to it a hovering flicker directly above the paper before transforming the flicker into a rapid glide of writing, then simultaneously gave the pen its freedom and said, "They should be back any moment now." Martin reached for the newspaper lying on a nearby table. It turned out to be a Russian emigre one, published in Paris. "How's school?" asked Zilanov, without raising his eyes from the evenly running pen. "Pretty good," said Martin, putting down the paper. "How long have they been out?" Zilanov did not answer. The pen was going at full tilt. In a few minutes later, though, he spoke again, still not looking at Martin. "Idling away your time, I imagine. Only thing colleges care about here is le sport." Martin grinned. Zilanov rapidly thumped a blotter all over the lines he had written and said, "Your mother keeps asking me for additional information, but I don't know anything more. I wrote her in the Crimea about the time, telling her everything I knew." Martin cleared his throat. "Что вы? What's that?" asked Zilanov, who had picked up that bit of bad Russian in Moscow. "Nothing," replied Martin. "I'm referring to your father's death, of course," said Zilanov, glancing with dull eyes at Martin. "If you remember, it was I who notified you at the time." "Yes, I know," said Martin, nodding hurriedly. He always felt embarrassed when strangers, even with the best intentions, spoke to him about his father. "Our last meeting is clear in my mind as if it had happened today," Zilanov went on. "We chanced to meet on the street. I was already hiding them. At first I did not want to go up to him, but Sergei Robertovich looked so appallingly sick. I remember he was very concerned about what was happening to you and your mother in the Crimea, and a couple of days later I went to see him, and they were carrying him out in the coffin." Martin kept nodding, searching agonizingly for a way to change the subject. Zilanov was telling him all this for the third time, and on the whole the narrative was a rather pale one. Zilanov turned over the sheet. His pen quivered and started again. To kill time, Martin again reached for the newspaper, but just then the front door lock clicked, and from the entrance hall came the sound of voices, of shuffling feet, and Irina's awful cackling laugh. 20. Martin went out to greet them, and as generally happened when he encountered Sonia, he instantly had the sensation that he stood in relief against a dark background. The same thing had happened on her last visit to Cambridge. She had come with her father, who had tormented him with questions about the age of the various colleges and the number of books in the library, while she and Darwin kept quietly laughing about something or other, and it came upon him again now, that strange torpor. His light blue necktie, the sharp points of his soft collar, his double-breasted suit, all seemed to be in order, and yet Martin had the impression, under Sonia's impenetrable gaze, that he was dressed shabbily, that his hair was badly brushed, and that he had shoulders like a furniture mover's, and that the roundness of his face was the shape of stupidity. No less repulsive were his big knuckles, which had reddened and grown swollen of late, what with his goalkeeping and the boxing lessons. The solid sense of contentment somehow related to the strength in his shoulders, the coolness of sleekly shaven cheeks, the reliability of a recently filled tooth, all of it vanished instantly in Sonia's presence, and what appeared particularly silly to him was the way his eyebrows petered out. They were thick only at their starting point, and then templeward took on a look of surprised sparseness. Supper was served. Miss Pavlov, a pudgy and dour lady who resembled her sister but smiled even more seldom than she, kept a habitual and discreet eye on Irina, seeing to it that her daughter ate decorously without leaning on a table too much, without licking her knife. Zilanov arrived a moment later, rapidly and energetically inserted a corner of his napkin under the collar, and half rising in his chair, snatched from clear across the table a roll, which he immediately sliced and buttered. His wife was reading a pet letter from the Raval, and as she read, saying to Martin, "Help yourself," on his left Irina fidgeted, scratched her armpit, and uttered sounds of endearment addressed to her cold mutton. On his right sat Sonia, and the way she had of taking salt with the tip of her knife, her short black hair with its harsh gloss, and the dimple on her pale cheek inevitably irritated him. After supper there came a telephone call from Darwin, who suggested they go dancing. Sonia played coy for a while, then agreed. Martin went to change, and was already pulling on his silk socks when Sonia told him through the door that she was tired, and would not go after all. Half an hour later Darwin arrived, very gay, very big and elegant, his top hat cocked, with tickets to a very expensive ball in his pocket. Martin told him that Sonia had wilted and gone to bed, whereupon Darwin drank a cup of tepid tea, gave an almost natural yawn, and said that in this world everything was for the best. Martin knew that he had travelled to London for the sole purpose of seeing Sonia, and when Darwin, in his unneeded top hat and opera cloak, went off whistling down the empty, dark street, Martin felt very hurt for him. He softly closed the front door and went upstairs to his bedroom. Sonia slipped out onto the passage to meet him, wearing a kimono and looking very short in heelless bedroom slippers. "Is he gone?" she asked. "Really rotten of you," Martin commented under his breath without stopping. "You could have stopped him," she said after him, adding quickly, "I know what, I'll go down and ring him up and go dancing, that's what I'll do." Without answering, Martin slammed his door, angrily brushed his teeth, yanked open his bed as if he wanted to throw somebody out of it, and dispatching the light with a murderous twist of his fingers, to pull the covers over his head. But a few minutes later, the thickness of the blanket did not prevent him from hearing Sonia's steps hurrying up the passage, and her door shutting. Was it possible that she had actually been downstairs and telephoned? He listened attentively, and after a new period of silence, there were footsteps again, only now they had a different, lighter, almost ethereal sound. Martin could not restrain himself. He stepped out onto the corridor and caught sight of Sonia hopping downstairs in a flamingo-colored frock, a fluffy fan in one hand and something bright encircling her black hair. She left her door open and the light on. In her room there remained a cloudlet of powder like the smoke following a shot. A stocking, killed outright, lay under the chair, and the motley innards of the wardrobe had spilled onto the carpet. Instead of being glad for his friend, Martin felt very hurt. All was still except for the heavy snores that came from the master bedroom. "G.D. her," he muttered, and for a while debated with himself whether he too should join them at the ball. After all, there were 3 tickets. He saw himself dashing up the sumptuous stairs, wearing his pumps and flat bows, his dinner jacket and silk shirt with the frilled front, as sported by the dandies that year. The flame of music shot from the open doors, the resilient, tender caress of a soft girl's leg which keeps giving way and yet pressing against you, the fragrant hair by your very lips, a cheek that leaves its powder on your silk lapel. All these immemorial and tender banalities stirred Martin deeply. He enjoyed dancing with a fair stranger, enjoyed the vacuous, chaste talk, through which he listened closely to that bewitching, vague something going on inside you and inside her, which will last a couple of bars more, and then, finding no resolutions, will vanish forever and utterly be forgotten. But while the bond of bodies is still unbroken, the outlines of a potential love affair begin to form, and the rough draft already comprises everything: the sudden silence between 2 people in some dimly lit room, the man carefully placing with trembling fingers on the edge of an ashtray the just lit but impedient cigarette, the woman's eyes slowly closing as in a filmed scene, and the rapt darkness, and in it a point of light, a glossy limousine, traveling fast through the rainy night, and suddenly a white terrace and the dazzling ripple of the sea, and Martin softly saying to the girl he has carried off, "Your name? What's your name?" Leafy shadows play on her luminous dress. She gets up, she goes away, the rapacious croupier takes in Martin's last chips, and he has nothing left but to thrust his hands into the empty pockets of his dinner jacket and descend slowly into the casino garden, and then sign on as a longshoreman. And there she is again aboard someone else's yacht, sparkling, laughing, flinging coins into the water. "Funny thing," said Darwin one night, as he and Martin came out of a small Cambridge cinema. "It's all unquestionably poor, vulgar, and rather implausible, and yet there is something exciting about all that flying foam, the femme fatale on the yacht, the ruined and ragged He-Man swallowing his tears." "It's nice to travel," said Martin. "I'd like to travel a lot." This fragment of conversation, surviving by chance from one April night, came back to Martin when, at the beginning of summer vacation already in Switzerland, he received a letter from Darwin in Tenerife. God, what a lovely emerald word! It was morning. Marie, with disastrously deteriorated looks and an oddly bloated appearance, was kneeling in a corner, wringing out a floor rag into a pail. Large white clouds glided above the mountains, catching on the peaks, and from time to time some smoky filaments would descend on the slopes, on which the light changed continuously with the ebb and flow of the sun. Martin went out into the garden, where Uncle Henry, wearing a monstrous straw hat, was talking with the village curé. When the curé, a small man with glasses, which he kept adjusting with the thumb and little finger of his left hand, made a low bow, and then, with a rustle of his black cassock, walked off by the shiny white wall and climbed into his cabriolet, hitched to a fat pinkish-white horse, all speckled with mustard. Martin said, "It's wonderful there, and I adore this region, but perhaps just for a few weeks I would like to take a trip somewhere, the Canary Islands, for instance." What folly, answered Uncle Henry with fright. and his mustache bristled slightly. "Your mother, who waited for you so anxiously, who was happy that you are staying with her until October, and suddenly you leave." "We could all go together," said Martin. "Grelifyili," Uncle Henry repeated. "Later, when you finish your studies, I'll have no objection. I have always believed that a young man should see the world. Remember that your mother is only now recovering from the shocks she suffered." "No, no, no." Martin shrugged, and with his hands in the pockets of his shorts, wandered off along the trail that led to the waterfall. He knew that his mother was waiting for him there, by the latch-shaded grotto. That was the agreement. She would go out walking very carefully, and not wanting to wake Martin, would leave him a note, by the grotto at 10, or near the spring on the road to Clare. However, even though he knew she was waiting, Martin suddenly changed direction, left the trail, and started upwards, across the heather. The slope became steeper and steeper. The sun was scorching. Flies kept trying to get at his lips and eyes. Upon reaching a circular birch grove, he rested, smoked a cigarette, pulled up sports stockings tighter, and resumed the ascent, munching on a birch leaf. The heather was crunchy and slippery. Now and then he caught his foot in some low thorn bushes. At the top of the incline gleamed an amassment of rocks, between which ran a crevice. It fanned out toward him and was filled with fine debris that came into motion as soon as he stepped out upon it. This way could not serve to reach the peak, so Martin began to climb straight up the face of the rocks. Occasionally some root or moss patch at which he clutched detached itself from the stone, and feverishly he would seek a support with his foot, or else it was his foothold that gave, and he would be left hanging by his hands and have to pull himself painfully up. The peak was almost within reach when he suddenly slipped and started to slither down, clutching at the shrublets of rough flowers. He lost his grip, feeling a burning pain at his knee, and scraped against the rock, attempted to embrace the steepness that was gliding up and past him, and abruptly salvation bumped against his soles. He found himself on a cornice. To the right it narrowed and merged with the cliff, but to the left it could be seen going on for a few yards before turning a corner. What then happened to it remained unknown. His ledge recalled the stage setting of nightmares. He stood pressing closely to the rock against which he had bruised his chest on the way down, and dared not unglue himself from it. With an effort, glancing over his shoulder, he saw under his heels a prodigious precipice, a sun-illumined abyss, within its depths several outdistanced firs running in panic after the descending forest, and still further down the steep meadows and the tiny ivory-white hotel. So that's what its message was, thought Martin with a superstitious shiver. I'll fall, I'll perish, that's what it's waiting for, that. It was equally terrifying to look down the precipice or up the vertical cliff above him, a width of bookshelf underfoot, and a knobby spot in the rock wall to which his fingers clung was all that Martin retained of solid world to which he was used. He experienced faintness, dizziness, sickening fear, yet at the same time he observed himself in the outside, noting with odd lucidity his open-collared flannel shirt, his clumsy clinging position on the ledge, the thistle ball that attached itself to its stocking, and the entirely black butterfly that fluttered by with enviable casualness like a little quiet devil and began to rise along the rock face. And although there was no one around to make showing off worthwhile, Martin began to whistle. Then he vowed to himself that he would pay no attention to the invitation of the abyss, and began to dispace his feet slowly as he moved to the left. Ah, if only one could see what the cornice did after it turned that corner. The rock wall seemed to push against his breast, crowding him toward the precipice, whose impatient breath he felt on his back. His nails dug into the stone. The stone was hot. The tufts of flowers were an intense blue. A lizard traced a quick, incomplete figure 8 and froze again. Flies tickled his face. Every now and then he had to stop, and he heard himself complaining to himself, "I cannot say any more. I cannot," and when he caught himself doing that, he began to produce with his lips a rudimentary tune, a foxtrot or the Marseillaise, and then moistened his lips, and again, complaining, resumed his sidewise progress. There remained only a yard or so to the turn when something began to spill from under his sole shoe. He could not help turning his head, and in the sunny void the white spot of the hotel started to rotate slowly. Martin closed his eyes and stopped short, but then he controlled his nausea and began to move again. At the turn he said rapidly, "Please, I beg you, please," and his request was immediately granted. Beyond the turn the shelf widened, became a platform, and beyond was the already familiar scree and the heather-covered slope. There he got his breath. His entire body ached and vibrated. His nails had become dark red as if he had been picking strawberries. The knee he had barked was smarting. The danger that he had just experienced seemed to him far more real than the one into which he had blundered in the Crimea. Now he felt proud of himself, but this pride suddenly was lost all its flavor when Martin asked himself if he could again perform, this time deliberately, what he had performed accidentally. In a few days he gave in, climbed up again the heather-grown steeps, but when he reached the platform where the cornice started, he could not make himself step on it. This angered him. He tried to incite himself. He taunted his own cowardice. Imagined Darwin looking at it with a mocking smile. He stood there for a while, then shrugged and turned back, doing his best to ignore the ruffian who was raging within him. Again and again, to the very end of vacation, that rowdy made eruptions and would riot so offensively that finally Martin decided not to walk up that mountain any more, to avoid being tormented by the sight of the narrow shelf which he dared not tread. In October he returned to England in a stinging mood of self-deprecation. Straight from the station he went to see the Zelenovs. The housemaid who opened the door was new, and this was unpleasant, making it seem he had come to the strange house. Sonia, dressed in all black, stood in the middle of the living room with smoothing her temples, then proffered her hand in a straight, sharp gesture, as was her wont. With amazement, Martin realized that not once during the summer had he thought of her, not once had he written, but that nonetheless it would have been worthwhile to travel a long way, if only for the sake of that embarrassment that he now felt as he looked at her pale, sullen face. "You probably have not heard of our grief," said Sonia, and in an oddly cross tone related that the week before, on the same day, they had received information that Nellie had died in childbirth in Brindisi, and her husband had been killed in the Crimea. "Ah, then he left Udenik to join Wrangel," said Martin lately, and with the exceptional clarity visualized that husband of Nellie's, whom he had seen but once, and Nellie herself, who at the time had seemed to him dull and insipid, and he now had gone and died in Brindisi. "Mother is in a terrible state," said Sonia, leafing through the book that lay abandoned on the sofa, "and Father's been traveling in secret to God knows what places, possibly as far as Kiev," she added after a while, and separating several pages with a thumb allowed them to mill rapidly. Martin seated himself in another armchair, rubbing his hands. Sonia slapped the book closed and said, raising her face, "Darwin has been perfect, simply perfect. He was a tremendous help to us, so touching, and not one wrong word. Are you staying for the night?" "Actually," said Martin, "I could go up to Cambridge tonight. It would surely bother you to put me up and so forth." "No, what nonsense," said Sonia and sighed. The sound of the dinner gong reached them from downstairs, and this clashed with the atmosphere of the morning that had pervaded the house. Martin went to wash his hands, and he entered the lavatory. He collided with Zelenov, who did not make it a custom to lock the door. He glanced at Martin out of lustreless eyes, while unhurriedly buttoning his fly. "Accept my deepest sympathy," muttered Martin, and he stupidly clicked his heels. Zelenov lowered his lids in a sign of gratitude and shook hands with Martin. The fact that all this occurred on the threshold of the lavatory underlined the absurdity of the hand-clasp and the ready-made words. Zelenov slowly walked off, his thighs twitching as if he were shaking down something between them. Martin's nose, as its owner noticed in the mirror, was wrinkled in anguish. "After all, I did have to say something," he muttered through his teeth. Dinner proceeded in silence, as if one discounted the old-fashioned slurp with which Zelenov ate his soup. Irina and her mother were at an out-of-town sanatorium, and Miss Zelenov did not come down, so they dined just the three of them. The telephone rang, and Zelenov marched to his study, chewing on the way. "I know you don't like mutton," Sonia said softly, and Martin silently smiled a slightly muted smile. "Loglovitch will drop in," said Zelenov, resuming his place at the table. "He has just returned from St. Petersburg. Pass me the mustard. He says he crossed the border wrapped in a shroud. Less conspicuous on snow," said Martin a moment later to keep up the conversation, but no conversation ensued. 22. Alexander Naumovich Leopoldovich turned out to be a fat-bearded man in a knit gray waistcoat and shabby black suit with dandruff on his shoulders. The side ears of a black prunella boot stuck out, and the ankle ties of this underpants glimmered through his sagging socks. The way he completely ignored inanimate objects, such as the arm support of the chair which he mechanically kept tapping with his hands, or the thick book on which he sat down by mistake, then took out from under him without a smile, and put aside without glancing at it, pointed to a secret affinity with Zelenov, nodding his large grizzly head. He only responded with a short clucking sound of his tongue, and to the news of his friend's bereavement, then quickly passing the palm of his hand down the coarsely fashioned face. without any preliminaries, launched into his story. It was obvious that the only thing that filled his consciousness, the only thing that preoccupied and affected him, was Russia's woe, and the trepidation Martin pictured to himself. What would happen if he were to interrupt Iogolovich's stormy, tense speech by telling the anecdote about the student and his girl cousin? Sonia sat at a distance, propping her elbows on her knees and her face on her palms. Zilanov listened, one finger stretched along his nose, occasionally removing the finger to say, "Excuse me, Alexander Nomovich, but for instance, when you mention," and Iogolevich would stop for an instant, blink, then resume his tale with a constant, remarkable motion of his rough, ceasingly changing features, his shaggy brows, the nostrils of his pear-shaped nose, the folds of his bearded cheeks, nor did his hands with the black hair on the phalanges rest for a second. They lifted something, tossed it upwards, seized it again, and strewed it in every direction, and all the while, hotly and rolling delivery, he spoke of executions, of famine, of St. Petersburg, turned into a desert, of the regime's malice, stupidity, and vulgarity. He left after midnight, and suddenly turning around on the threshold, asked how much Koloshi rubbers cost in London. After the door had closed, Zilanov remained standing, lost in thought, then went upstairs to his wife. The doorbell rang 3 minutes later. Iogolevich had come back. It turned out that he did not know the way to the tube station. Martin offered to take him there, and while striding at Iogolovich's side, cast about in distress for a subject of conversation. "Remind your father," said Iogolevich abruptly. "I quite forgot to tell him that Maximov is impatient to receive the article of his impressions from visiting the Southern Volunteer Army. He will know what it's about. Just tell him. Maximov has written to your father before." "Certainly," answered Martin, and was about to add something, but checked himself. He slowly returned to the house, imagining how Iogolevich crossing the border wrapped in a white sheet, then Zilanov with his briefcase at some demolished railroad station under the starry Ukrainian sky. All was silent in the house when he went up the stairs. He kept yawning while he undressed. He felt an odd, vague anguish. The lamp on the bedside table burned bright. The wide bed looked white and soft. His dressing gown of lustrous blue silk had been taken out of his bag by the maid and was slung invitingly over the armchair. He noticed with a shock of vexation that he had forgotten to bring up from the living room a book that he had set his heart on there and had been looking forward to reading in bed. He pulled on the dressing gown and walked down to the second floor. The book was a dilapidated volume of Chekhov's stories. He found it. For some reason it was lying on the floor, and returned to his bedroom. The heartache did not dissipate, although Martin was one of those people for whom a good book before sleep is something to look forward to all day. Such a person, upon happening to recall amidst routine occupations that on his bedside table a book is waiting for him, a perfect safety, feels a surge of inexpressible happiness. Martin began to read, choosing the story he knew, loved, could read through 100 times in a row. The Lady with the Little Dog. Ah, how nicely she lost that lorgnette in the crowd on the pier in Yalta, and here, without any apparent reason, he realized what it was that disturbed him so. Only a year before, in this room, Nellie had slept, and now she was dead. "What nonsense," muttered Martin, and he tried to resume his reading, but this proved impossible. He recalled those nights of long ago, and he waited for the ghost of his father to make a scratching sound in a corner. Martin's heart started to beat fast. The bed became hot and uncomfortable. He imagined how he himself would be dying some day. He felt as if the ceiling were coming down on him slowly and inexorably. Something began to drum rapidly in the darker part of the room, and his heart missed a beat. But it was merely water that had been spilled on the washstand. It was now dripping onto the linoleum. How strange. If ghosts exist, then all is well, for it proves that souls can move after death. Why, then, is it so frightening? How shall I be dying myself, thought Martin, and began to pass mentally in review several varieties of death. He saw himself placed against a wall, standing there with as much air in his lungs as he could inhale, waiting for the volley of rifle shots, and recollecting with wild despair that this present minute, this bright room, the soft night, unconcern, safety. Then there was no illness, dreadful illness, rending one's entrails. Or it might be a railway accident, or simply the serene slowing down of old age, death in one's sleep, or else a dark wood in pursuit. Nonsense, thought Martin. I have plenty of time to reserve. Besides, every year represents a whole epoch. Why worry? Yet perhaps Nellie is here and is seeing me now. Perhaps now this instant she will give me a sign. He looked at his watch. It was close to 2. The tension was becoming unbearable. That silence seemed to be waiting. The distant hoot of an automobile horn would have been rapture. The level of silence kept rising, and all at once, poured over the brim, someone on tiptoe was coming barefoot along the passage. "Are you asleep?" came the whispered question through the door, and for an instant a constriction in his throat prevented Martin from replying. She slipped in, she softly shifted from tiptoe to heel. She wore yellow pajamas, her black hair was rumpled. Thus she remained standing for a moment or two, blinking through the matted lashes. Martin, sitting up in bed, grinned foolishly. "Sleep is utterly out of the question," said Sonia, in an odd voice. "I'm jumpy, I'm scared, and on top of it, those horrors he talked about." "Why are you barefoot, Sonia? Want my slippers?" She shook her head, pouting pensively, then tossed her hair and cast a vague glance at Martin's bed. "Alles hopp," said Martin, tapping the blanket at the foot of his bed. She climbed onto the bed, first kneeled upon it, then moved about slowly, and finally curled up on the blanket in the corner formed by the footboard and wall. Martin pulled out the pillow from under his head to place it behind her back. "Spasibo, thanks," she said quite soundlessly. The outline of the word could only be guessed from the movement of her plump, pale lips. "Are you comfortable?" asked Martin nervously, pulling up his knees so as not to be in her way, but presently he bent forward again, and taking his dressing gown from the adjacent chair, covered her bare feet with it. "Give me a cigarette," she asked after a minute of silence. A waft of delicate warmth emanated from her. A thin chainlet of gold surrounded her adorable neck. She inhaled, slitting her eyes, and handed the cigarette to Martin. "Too strong," she said sadly. "What did you do this summer?" inquired Martin, struggling to subdue a dark something that was quite mad and unthinkable, and that even induced a febrile chill. "Nothing in particular. We went to Brighton." She sighed and added, "I flew in a hydroplane." "And I very nearly got killed," said Martin. Yes, very nearly. High up in the mountains, rock climbing, lost my old hold. Saved by a miracle." Sonia smiled dimly and said, "You know, Martin, she always maintained that the most important thing in life was always to do one's duty and think of nothing else. It's a very deep thought, isn't it?" "Yes, possibly," Martin replied, showing the unfinished cigarette into the ashtray with an uncertain hand. "Possibly, but sometimes a bit boring." "Oh, no, not at all. You don't understand. She didn't mean to work or job, but a kind of, well, the kind of thing which has an inner importance." She paused, and Martin saw her shiver in her light little pajamas. "You are cold," he said. "Yes, I think I am." "And what was the duty to be performed? But I, for instance, do not have any such thing inside." "Sonia," said Martin, "maybe you'd like—" He turned back a corner of the blanket, and she rose to a kneeling position and moved slowly in his direction. "And it seems to me," she continued as she crawled under the bedclothes, which Martin, hearing nothing of what she was saying, awkwardly pulled over her and himself, "it seems to me that lots of people do not know this, and because they don't—" With a deep intake of breath, Martin embraced her and attached his lips to her cheek. Sonia seized him by his wrist and forthwith rolled out of bed. "Good God," she said, "good God!" Her dark eyes glistened with tears, and within an instant her whole face was wet, with bright long streaks creeping down her cheeks. "Oh, please, please don't. I don't know. Oh, Sonia." Martin kept muttering, not daring to touch her, losing his head at the thought that she might start screaming and arouse the entire household. "How couldn't you see," she said plaintively, "how couldn't you see that this was the way I used to come to Nellie, and we talked and talked till dawn?" She turned away and left the room crying. Martin sat in a chaos of bedclothes with a helplessly ingratiating expression on his face. She closed the door behind her, but reopened it and introduced her head. "Idiot," she said in a perfectly calm, businesslike manner, whereupon the patter of her bare feet receded along the passage. For some time Martin kept staring at the white door. Then he put out the light and attempted to sleep. This appeared to be hopeless. He reflected that at daybreak he must dress, get packed, and noiselessly leave the house to go straight to the station. Unfortunately, he fell asleep amidst those meditations and woke up only at 9:15. Maybe it was all a dream, he said to himself with some hope, but at once shook his head and with a pang of excruciating shame wondered how he would meet Sonia again after this. He had an unfortunate morning. When he rushed in to take his bath, there at the washstand was Zelenkov, his short legs on the black trousers set wide apart, his torso in a thick flannel undershirt bent forward, dousing his face over the basin, rubbing cheeks and forehead until the skin squeaked, snorting under a sprouting faucet, pressing each nostril in turn, fiercely relieving his nose, and expectorating. Come in, I'm through," he exclaimed, and blinded by water, dripping, holding his arms in semblance of short wings, he dashed to his bedroom where he preferred to keep his towel. Then a little later, as Martin was on his way downstairs to the dining room to drink his cup of hemlock, he ran into Miss Zelenkov. Her face, livid and swollen, looked awful. He felt dreadfully embarrassed, not daring to utter stock words of compassion, but not knowing any others. In acknowledgment of his silence, she put her arms around him, kissed him on the forehead, and with a hopeless wave of her hand walked away to the bottom of the corridor, where her husband mentioned to her something about a passport. With a totally unexpected tender break in his voice, of which he had seemed wholly incapable, Sonia met Martin in the dining room, and the first thing she said to him was, "I forgive you, because you are Swiss, and cretin is a Swiss word. Jot that down." Martin had planned to explain that he had no wicked intentions, which on the whole was the truth, that all he had wanted to do was to lie close to her and keep kissing her cheek. But Sonia looked so cross and cheerless in her black dress that he thought it best to say nothing. "Papa is leaving to Gay for Brindisi," she said. Thank goodness they did give him a visa at last. She contemplated with disapproval the poorly contained greed with which Martin, who always felt ravenous in the morning, was devouring his fried eggs. Martin told himself there was no point in hanging around. The day promised to be topsy-turvy. The seeing off ritual and all the rest. "Darwin has telephoned," added Sonia. "23. Darwin made his appearance with comedy precision immediately in the wake of Sonia's remark, as if he had been waiting in the wings. The seaside sun had given him a roast beef complexion, and he wore a marvelous pale grey suit. Sonia's greeting struck Martin as a little too languorous. Martin himself was grasped, hit on the shoulder, hit in the ribs, and asked repeatedly why he had not phoned. Indeed, the usually indolent Darwin displayed that day unprecedented energy. At Liverpool Street Station, he took a stranger's trunk from the porter to carry it balanced on his nape. In the Pullman, midway between London and Cambridge, after a glance at his wristwatch, he called the conductor, handed him a banknote, and solemnly pulled the emergency cord. The train groaned agonizingly and came to a stop, while Darwin smugly explained to everybody at large that he was born exactly 24 years ago. A day later, one of the livelier newspapers had a note about it, conspicuously headlined, "Young author stops a train on birthday." Meanwhile, Darwin had been summoned by his tutor, whom he was now trying to hypnotize with a detailed report on his leech commerce, what were the better sorts, and how they were bred. The same damp greeted Martin in his bedroom. There was the same interchime of towers, and in the same old way Vadim would tumble in with a sample of the same rhymed Russian alphabet, consisting of couplets. The first verse containing a didactic item of general interest, at minions like to fish and hunt, or balloons are never made of brick, and the second equally didactic, beginning with the same letter, but quite unrelated to the first line and considerably more improper. Archibald Moon, however, although in the sense of the same, seemed to be different. Martin could not manage to recapture the old enchantment. Moon told him that during the summer he had completed as many as 16 new pages of the history of Russia, fully 16 pages. He devoted to work every hour of the long summer day. He explained that he was able to accomplish so much because he devoted work every hour of the long summer day, and as he had made it with his fingers a gesture of representing the ripple and plasticity of every phrase that he had nursed to life in that gesture, Martin seemed to discern something extremely depraved, and to listen to Moon's rich speech was like chewing thick, elastic, Turkish delight powdered with confectioner's sugar. For the first time Martin felt personally offended by Moon's treating Russia as an inanimate article of luxury. When he confided this to Darwin, Darwin laughed and nodded and said that Moon was like that because of his addiction to Uranism. This called for closer attention, and after one occasion when Moon, without any excuse, stroked Martin's hair with trembling fingers, Martin stopped dropping in, and would noiselessly climb out of the window and down a rain-pipe into the lane whenever there came that yearnful, lonesome knock on the door of his room. He nevertheless continued to attend Moon's lectures, but now in studying Russian literature, he endeavored to efface from his hearing Moon's intonations, which kept pursuing him, especially in the rhythm of verse. He ended by switching to another teacher, grand old Professor Stevens, whose interpretation of Pushkin and Tolstoy was as honest as it was ponderous, and who spoke Russian in gasps and barks, with the frequent addition of Serbian and Polish. Still, it took time to shake off Archibald Moon for good. He would recall with involuntary admiration the artistry of Moon's discourse. The moment after would perceive as a vivid reality the picture of Moon carrying away to his rooms a sarcophagus with Russian mummy. In the end, Martin did get entirely rid of Moon, while appropriating this or that element, but converting it to his own property, and then at last the voices of the Russian muses began to sound in complete purity. Moon would occasionally be seen in the street in the company of that beautiful chubby youth with abundant blonde hair who impersonated girls in the university productions of Shakespeare's plays, whereat Moon would melt with tender emotion at an orchestra's feet, and together with the other amateurs try to shush Darwin, whose sprawling and feigned rapture exploded with clownish applause at the wrong moments. But Martin had some unsettled accounts with Darwin, too. It happened sometimes that Darwin went to London alone, and Martin spent Saturday night till daybreak, till a total exhaustion of coal, sitting in the sepulchral draught of the fireplace and persistently, savagely, as if pressing upon an aching tooth, imagining Sonia and Darwin in a dark automobile. Once, when unable to stand it any longer, he set off for London, attended to dance which he had not been invited, and paced the halls under the impression that he looked very pale and stern, but they happened to catch in a mirror the reflection of his pink round face with a bump on his forehead, a result of his diving for the ball under rushing feet the day before. Presently they arrived, Sonia costumed as a gypsy girl, seemingly having forgotten that not quite 4 months had elapsed since her sister's death, and Darwin dressed as an Englishman out of continental novel, a large checked suit, tropical helmet with a bandana to protect the nape from the Pompeian sun, a Baedeker under his arm, a carroty side whiskers. There was music, there was serpentine, there was a snowstorm of confetti, and for an intoxicating moment Martin felt as if he was taking part in a subtle drama of masks. The music stopped, ignoring Darwin's obvious desire to be alone with Sonia. Martin climbed into the same taxicab with them. In a chance beam of light that penetrated the dark car, he thought he noticed Darwin and Sonia holding hands, and tried wretchedly to conceive himself that it had only been a trick of shimmer and shadow. Even more depressing were the occasions when Sonia came to Cambridge. Martin felt unwanted, imagined they kept trying to shed him. His second summer in Switzerland was marked by his beating one of the best Swiss tennis players. But what did Sonia care about his triumphs in tennis, boxing, or soccer? Sometimes Martin visualized in picturesque daydream how he would return to Sonia from fighting in the Crimea, and the word cavalry thundered by, and the wind whistled. Clods of black mud flew in one's face, attack, 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 of the horseshoes, Anapest of the gallop. But it was too late now. Fighting in the Crimea had ceased long ago. Long gone was the day Nellie's husband, riding full speed at an enemy machine gun, came nearer and nearer until he inadvertently swept across the invisible line to a region still tingling with echoes of earthly life, but where there are neither machine guns nor cavalry attacks. Always remiss, mumbled Martin at himself gloomily, and with the piercing sense that something had been missed forever, kept again and again imagining the ribbon of St. George, the light wound on his left shoulder. It had to be the left, and Sonia coming to meet him at Victoria Station. He was irritated by his mother's tender smile, by her words she could not withhold. Now you see it was all for nothing, and you would have perished for nothing. Nellie's husband, that's a different matter. He was a real professional soldier. Such people cannot exist without a war, and he died the way he wanted to die. But those thousands of youngsters mowed down. However, in the presence of foreigners, she would hotly insist on the necessity of continued military action, especially now that it was all over, and there was nothing there could lure her son. In later years, when she remembered her relief and her calm, Miss Edelweiss groaned aloud. Oh yes, she could have preserved him. Should not have so easily dismissed her forebodings, been more observant, been always on the lookout, and who knows, it might have been better had he really joined the White Army, been wounded, caught in the typhus, and at this price got rid once of all for the attraction that danger has for young boys. But why harbor such thoughts, and why give in to despair? More courage, more faith. People do get lost, and then come back. A rumor may circulate that someone has been seized at the border and shot as a spy, yet all at once there he is, alive, with his familiar laugh and deep voice right there in the entry hall. And if Henry again... 24. Not only his mother's fleeting smile of content had irritated Martin that second summer, there was something else besides, something far more unpleasant. Life at the chalet seemed to him strangely changed, as if moving on tiptoe, with bated breath. It was odd to hear Uncle Henry call Miss Edelweiss not Sophie, as before, but cher amie, and she too addressed him now and then as my dear. A new softness and increased welling of sentiment showed in him. His voice had grown lower, his movements gentler. One's praise for soup in the joint was now enough to veil his eyes with moisture. The cult around Martin's father's memory had acquired a tinge of unbearable mysticism. Miss Edelweiss was more than ever conscious of her guilt before her late husband, while Uncle Henry seemed to be tracing for her a difficult but sure road of expiation, when remarking how happy Sergei's spirit must be to see her in his cousin's house. Once he even produced a nail file, and with agreeably melancholy began to pass it back and forth over his nails. But at this Miss Edelweiss could not contain herself and emitted a hollow laugh which unexpectedly became a fit of hysterics. In his haste to help, Martin opened the kitchen faucet so briskly that the water splashed on his white flannels. Not infrequently did he observe his mother as she walked in the garden leaning wearily on Henry's arm, or as she fetched for Henry a bedtime cup of fragrant London tea. It was all depressing, embarrassing, and strange. Just before his departure for Cambridge, she obviously wanted to break the news to him, but she found it as embarrassing as he. She faltered and only said that she perhaps would soon write to him an important event, and indeed that winter Martin received a letter not from her but from his uncle, who on 6 pages informed him in a flowing hand, in bombastic, tear-jerking language, that he was marrying Martin's mother, a very modest ceremony at the village church, and only upon reaching the postscriptum, Martin realized that the wedding had already taken place, and mentally thanked his mother for having scheduled this grim celebration to coincide with his absence. At the same time, he kept asking himself how he would face her again, what they would talk about, and what would he manage to forgive the betrayal. For no matter how you approached it, it was, beyond any doubt, a betrayal of his father's memory. Furthermore, he was plagued by the thought that for stepfather he had Uncle Henry, of the fluffy whiskers and limited wits. When Martin arrived for Christmas, his mother could not help stop hugging him and weeping, as if forgetting to oblige Uncle Henry, her usual restraint, and there was simply nowhere to hide from the soft emotion in his stepfather's kindly eyes, and from the solemnity of that little cough of his. In general, during his last university year, Martin was made aware again and again of the presence of some malevolent force obstinately trying to convince him that life was not at all the easy, happy thing that he had imagined. Sonia's existence, the constant gratuitous attention it extorted from his soul, her visits that only tormented him, the derisive tone of her banter that had become established between them, all of it was extremely exhausting. That unrequited love did not prevent him, however, from running after every pretty girl and tingling with bliss when, for instance, Rose, the goddess of the tea-room, consented to go with him for a motor-car drive. In that shop, much frequented by students, you could buy pastry of every imaginable color, bright red with speckles of cream that made them look like deadly amanitas, purplish blue like violet-scented soap, and glossy black negroid with a white sole. One went on devouring cake after cake till one's innards got glued together in the ever-present hope of at last discovering something really good, with the dusk flush of her velvety cheeks, and a liquid gaze. Clad in a black dress with a soubrette little apron, Rose tripped rapidly back and forth through the room, nimbly evading collision with the other waitress, navigating also at full speed. Martin immediately noticed Rose's thick-fingered red hand, not in the least embellished by the tiny star of the cheap ring, and decided wisely never to look at her hands but to concentrate on her long eyelashes, which she lowered so beautifully while writing out a check. One day, while drinking rich, sweet chocolate, he passed her a note, and that same evening walked with her in the rain. On Saturday, he hired an unusual ramshackle limousine and spent the night with her at an ancient inn some 50 kilometers from Cambridge. He felt somewhat taken aback, though flattered, when she said it was her first affair. She made love stormily, clumsily, rustically, and Martin, who had expected to find her a frivolous and experienced siren, felt so disconcerted that he turned to Darwin for advice. "You'll get kicked out of the university," calmly said Darwin. "Nonsense," retorted Martin, frowning. Yet, when 3 weeks later Rose, as she put down a cup of chocolate before him, informed him in a quick whisper that she was pregnant, it seemed as if that meteorite, which ordinarily lands somewhere in the Gobi Desert, had fallen straight upon him. "Congratulations," said Darwin, after which, not without artistry, he began to delineate the fate of a simple girl with a babe in her belly. "And you will be sent down. That's a fact." "No one will know. I shall straighten out everything," stammered Martin. "It's hopeless," said Darwin. Martin suddenly lost his temper and walked out, banging the door. He ran out into the lane and nearly crashed under the impact of a large pillow that his friend had skillfully aimed at his head from the second-floor window. When Martin reached the corner and glanced back, he saw Darwin come out, pick up the pillow, shake it, and return it to the house. "Cruel brute," muttered Martin, and went straight to the tea-room. It was crowded. Bright-eyed, dusky Rose flitted from table to table, tripped along with a tray, tenderly moistening her pencil with the tip of her tongue, wrote out a check. He also wrote some lines on a leaf from his agenda, namely, "I want you to marry me, Martin Edelweiss." He thrust the leaflet into her hideous hand, then left, spent a couple of hours pondering about the town, roaming about the town, returned home, lay down on the sofa, and remained lying until nightfall. 25. At nightfall, Darwin dropped in, magnificently flung off his gown, sat down by the fire, and immediately began livening up the coals with a poker. Martin lay in silence, full of self-pity, again and again imagining himself coming out of the church with Rose, who was wearing white kid gloves, pulled on with difficulty. "Sonia is coming alone tomorrow," said Darwin unconcernedly. Her mother's got the flu, a bad case of the flu. Martin said nothing, but visualized with a stab of excitement tomorrow's soccer match. How are you going to play, though? Said Darwin. That, of course, is the question. Martin remained silent. Badly, probably, Darwin resumed. Goalkeeping needs presence of mind, and you're in one heck of a state. You know, I just had a chat with that woman. Silence. The tower chimes rang across the town. A poetic nature, inclined to fantasy, Darwin went on a minute later. She's no more pregnant than, for instance, I am. Want to bet a fiver that I can twist this poker into a monogram? Martin lay like a dead man. I interpret your silence as assent. Let's see. He grunted once, twice. No, can't do it today. The money's yours. I paid exactly £5 for your stupid declaration. We're even, and everything's in order. Martin was silent, only his heart had just begun beating violently. But, said Darwin, just remember, if you ever set foot in that bad and expensive pastry shop again, you'll get kicked out of the university. That last can be impregnated by a mere handshake. Don't forget that. Darwin got up and stretched. You're not very talkative, chum. I must confess that you and your hetera have somewhat marred tomorrow for me. I mean, the morrow one has one in mind. He went out, quietly closing the door behind him, and Martin had three simultaneous thoughts: that he was terribly hungry, that you couldn't find another friend like that, and that tomorrow his friend would propose. At that moment he joyously and ardently wished that Sonia would accept, but the moment passed, and next morning, when he and Darwin met Sonia at the station, he felt the odd, familiar, dreary jealousy, his only rather pathetic advantage over Darwin, and his recent wine-toasted transition to the intimate second-person singular, the Russian "tea" with Sonia. In England that form had died out with the Bowman. Nonetheless, Darwin had also drunk Auf Bruderschaft with her, and had addressed her all evening with an archaic thou. "Hello, Flower," she said casually to Martin, alluding to his botanical last name. Then at once turning away, she began telling Darwin things that might have interested Martin too. What's so attractive about her, after all? He thought for the 1000th time. All right, she has more dimples, that pale complexion. That's not enough. Her eyes are so, gypsy-esque. Her teeth are uneven, and her lips are so thick, so glossy, if one could just stop them, shut them up with a kiss, and she thinks she looks English in that little blue suit and those low-heeled shoes. Don't you people see she's just a short little thing? Who those people were, Martin didn't know, and they would have had a difficult time passing judgment, for as soon as Martin achieved an attitude of indifference toward Sonia, he would suddenly notice what a graceful back she had, how she tilted her head, how her slanted eyes ran across him with a swift chill, and the undercurrent of mirth in her speech bathed the base of each phrase, until abruptly her laughter burst into the open, and she would stress her words with a shake of her tightly furled umbrella, which she held not by its handle but by its body of silk, and ambling despondently, now behind them, now alongside, on the cobbled pavement, it was impossible for three people to walk abreast on the sidewalk because of the resilient cushion of the air surrounding Darwin's massive form, and because of Sonia's short, weaving steps. Martin reflected that, adding up all the random hours he had spent with her here in London, the total would be no more than a month and a half of constant companionship, and to think that he had met her more than 2 years ago, and now third, and last Cambridge winter was already on the wane. Yet he really could not tell what sort of person she was, and whether or not she was in love with Darwin, and how she could react if Darwin were to tell her about yesterday's experience, and whether she had spoken to anyone about that night, that miserable, yet by now oddly ravishing and not in the least shameful night, when shivering barefoot in her skimpy yellow pajamas, she had been borne ashore by the waves of silence and gently deposited on his blanket. They reached their destination. Sonia washed her hands in Darwin's bedroom. She took out her puff, blew on it, and powdered her face. The luncheon table was laid for 5. Fathom had, of course, been invited, but Archibald Moon had long since disappeared from their circle of friends, and it was even a little strange to recall that he had once been considered a desirable guest. The 5th member of the party was a slender, snub-nosed, blond youth, not handsome but nicely built and so eccentrically dressed. He had on the fine, elongated hands with popular novelists endowed and artistic individuals, yet he was neither poet nor painter, and the graceful, delicate flattery, something about him, along with his knowledge of French and Italian and slightly un-British but very elegant manners, was attributed to Cambridge, to his father's Florentine origin. Teddy, kindly, ethereal Teddy, belonged to the Roman Church, liked climbing and skiing in the Alps, was a good oarsman, played the old royal game of court tennis, although he knew how to be very tender with women, carried chastity to a ridiculous extreme. A year later, however, he announced a certain change in a note from Martin to Paris. "Yesterday," he wrote, "I got myself a wench, quite clean and all that." Underneath he studied vulgarity. There was something sorrowful and nervous about that statement. Martin recalled his sudden fits of melancholy and self-castigation, his love for Leopardi, and for snow, and how he had furiously smashed a perfectly innocent Etruscan vase upon receiving an insufficiently brilliant grade in examination. What fun to stare when a great big bear, said Sonia, echoed Vadim, who had long since become chummy with her, but prudently omitted the punchline after a tiny dog. Vdot za ruchku malinkyu suchku. While Teddy, who did not understand Russian, cocked his head to inquire, what does melanzus mean? Whereupon everybody laughed and no one could explain, and he began addressing Sonia thus, have some more peas, melanzus. Jittery, jittery? Vadim asked Martin. Don't be silly, replied Martin. I didn't sleep well last night. And that means muffling today. They have 3 international chess players, and we have only 2. Can't stand soccer, declared Teddy. Darwin upheld him. Both were Estonians, and Eton had its own special ball game in place of soccer.